So I want you to try a little experiment with me today. It's essentially a mental exercise.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah, so wherever you are right now as you're listening to this, maybe you're driving your car, maybe you're at the gym, or just folding laundry at home, I want you to mentally scan your immediate environment and just look for the plastic.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is going to be a very long
It's
list.
infinite, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's the dashboard of your car. It's the buttons on your shirt. It's the synthetic fibers in the carpet right under your feet.
Huh?
It's literally the phone or the headphones you're using to listen to us right now.
You really can't escape it.
You can't. But I actually don't want to focus on the stuff you were using at this exact moment.
Yeah.
I want to focus on the feeling you get when you are finally done using it.
The disposal moment.
Exactly, the disposal moment.
Yeah.
Picture this scenario, because we have all been there. You just finished eating a takeout meal,
Right.
and you're holding that heavy black plastic container. You know, the one with the clear lid?
Oh, yeah, the really sturdy ones.
Yeah, those. So you were standing over your kitchen bin, and you rinse it out, because you know you're a conscientious citizen, you want to do the right thing, and you look at the bottom of the container for that little tiny triangle with the number inside it.
The recycling symbol?
Right. You squint at it, you toss it into the blue recycling bin, and then you feel it.
That little twinge.
That sudden spike of anxiety, that little voice that says, did I clean it enough? Is this actually recyclable in my specific zip code?
Yeah.
Is the number 5 okay, or do they only take 1s and 2s?
Right, like did I just contaminate the entire truckload of recycling?
Exactly. Am I personally destroying the planet right now?
It really is a very specific, very modern form of neurosis. It's basically a recycler's guilt.
Recycler's guilt, yes.
Yeah.
And here is the first major thing we need to understand from the source material we are diving into today. That feeling,
Yeah.
that specific guilt, that is not an accident.
Yeah, not at all.
And it isn't a natural human reaction either.
Yeah.
It was engineered.
It is quite literally a product. That guilt you're feeling is the result of a marketing strategy that has been running smoothly for 70 years, just to ensure the actual producers of the waste never have to take responsibility for it.
Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. Today we are unpacking a book that, quite honestly, it made me furious.
It is definitely a frustrating read.
It really is. We are looking at the book Plastic Ink by
Yeah.
Beth Gardiner. And I just have to say right up front, this book completely dismantled how I see the modern world.
It's a total paradigm shift.
It is, because I have spent my entire life thinking of plastic as primarily a litter problem or, a waste management issue.
Yeah.
I see a plastic bottle washed up on the beach, and my immediate thought is, man, people are so careless. We need better laws against littering. We need beach cleanups.
Right, focusing on the consumer end of the life cycle.
Exactly. But Gardner takes that entire framework and just flips it completely upside down.
Right.
She argues that plastic isn't a litter problem at all. It is a business plan.
A survival strategy, actually.
Yes, a survival strategy for the oil and gas industry. And that is the core disconnect we are exploring today. Because you and I, the listeners out there, we are all out here trying so hard. We're buying those expensive metal straws. We are carrying around those reusable Kansas tote bags that we honestly always forget in the trunk of the car.
Oh, I always forget them.
Right. We're desperately trying to use less stuff. Meanwhile, the fossil fuel industry is out there spending billions, and I mean billions with a B, to ensure that we have absolutely no choice but to use more of it.
Gardner actually calls this the secret history of plastic. And to really understand the present, to understand why you literally cannot buy an English cucumber at the store without it being shrink-wrapped in its own individual plastic sleeve, you have to understand the past.
We have to go way back.
You do. You have to understand a specific laboratory explosion that happened in 1933. You have to look at a severe shortage of billiard balls in the 1860s. And you have to look at a moment of sheer panic in a corporate boardroom in 1945.
It honestly reads like a corporate thriller. We've got these secret backroom alliances between big oil and big tobacco. We have this massive cultural project she calls the invention of disposability.
And we have this deeply terrifying concept looming over everything called the Plan B.
Which is ultimately where we are heading today. The Plan B is their end game. It explains why, despite all the local bans on plastic bags and the global public outcry, plastic production is actually rapidly accelerating right now.
But we can't start at the end game. we have to start with the accident. And I love this part of the story so much because it just shows how completely random human history can be.
Yeah, we really need to travel to Cheshire, England for this.
So set the scene for us, because it's not the sleek, modern, high-tech, sterile lab we might imagine when we think of chemical engineering today.
No, not at all. It's March 1933. We are at Imperial Chemical Industries, or ICI. This is a very gritty, very industrial environment. Brick buildings, heavy machinery. And we have these two researchers named Eric Fawcett and Reginald Gibson.
Okay.
They're chemists, and they are basically playing with fire. Now, to be clear, they aren't in this lab actively trying to invent Ziploc sandwich bags, right?
Oh, no, they aren't trying to make consumer products at all. They are doing very fundamental, basic research on a gas called ethylene. Now, we really need to pause on ethylene for a second because ethylene is effectively the main character of our entire story.
Right.
Ethylene is a gas. It is a natural byproduct of refining oil and natural gas. When you process crude oil, you get this ethylene gas left over. And in 1933, it was largely considered just industrial waste.
It was junk.
Yeah.
So they have this tank of waste gas, and they decide the best thing to do is to just squeeze it really hard.
Essentially, yes. They decide to subject this gas to immense pressure. They are mixing the ethylene with benzaldehyde, and they pump it into this heavy steel reaction vessel. And they crank the pressure all the way up to 1,400 atmospheres.
1,400 atmospheres. Okay, just to give us and the listeners a proper sense of scale here, what does that actually mean in physical terms?
Well, that is 1,400 times the pressure of the standard air sitting in the room around us right now. It is roughly the equivalent pressure you would feel if you were standing at the bottom of the deepest part of the Mariana Trench, with literally miles of solid ocean water crushing down on top of you.
So they have this small metal tube filled with waste gas, and they're crushing it with the weight of the deep ocean.
Exactly. It is quite literally a bomb just waiting to go off in their lab. So they set it up, they leave the experiment running overnight, and they go home. They come back the next morning, and they carefully open the valve on the vessel, expecting, well, honestly, they didn't really know what to expect. They were maybe hoping for a chemical reaction that might drop out some kind of new liquid.
And what happens?
Nothing comes out. The tube looks completely empty at first glance.
So it was a bust.
That's what they thought. But then they look a little closer inside the tube. And Gibson writes this incredibly understated but famous line in his laboratory logbook. He writes, "Waxy solid found in reaction tube."
Waxy solid. I mean, that does not sound very revolutionary.
It didn't look revolutionary either. It basically looked like a chunk of paraffin wax. It was white and sort of greasy to the touch. They scraped it out of the tube and they started testing it. And they realized it was remarkably tough. It was completely water resistant. They had successfully managed to polymerize the ethylene gas.
They created polyethylene.
Exactly. They created polyethylene.
Which is today the single most common plastic on planet Earth.
It was the birth of the modern polymer age, sitting right there in a steel tube. But here is the massive plot twist of the story. They couldn't do it again.
Wait, what do you mean they couldn't do it again? They just did it.
They tried to replicate their own experiment. They meticulously set up the exact same equipment, same exact pressure, same mixture of gas, and boom, huge explosions.
Like serious, dangerous explosions.
Very serious. Serious enough that they completely blew out the heavy steel seals and caused major damage to the laboratory. It actually got so bad and so volatile that the senior directors at ICI stepped in and ordered them to stop immediately. Yeah, they basically said, this is way too dangerous. Stop blowing up our expensive equipment. Pack up the project. You're done.
That is wild. So we almost didn't have the modern plastic industry just because of standard workplace safety protocols.
We almost didn't have it because they fundamentally didn't understand the chemistry of what had happened that first night. It actually took ICI 2 full years to figure out what went wrong with all the follow-up experiments. Or, I guess more accurately, they had to figure out what went right the very first time.
And what was it?
It turns out that their very first setup, the one that made the waxy solid the car, it had a leak.
A leak.
A tiny microscopic leak in the heavy vessel that accidentally let in a trace amount of oxygen from the room. We're talking just a few parts per million of oxygen, but that tiny bit of oxygen acted as a chemical catalyst. It is what actually kickstarted the entire chemical chain reaction. Without that accidental leak, without that exact specific mistake, the reaction just doesn't happen at all.
Wow. That's the classic penicillin moment, right? A total laboratory accident just randomly changes the course of the world.
It really is. But Unlike penicillin, which obviously saves human lives, almost immediately, this little waxy solid just sat on a shelf for quite a while. It was an industrial curiosity. Nobody had any idea what to actually do with it. That is until the Nazis started sinking British ships.
Okay, so this is the massive pivot to World War II. And this brings us into section 1 of our deep dive today, which we are calling From War Hero to Consumer King. Because I think we completely forget today that plastic wasn't always viewed as the villain. At one point in history, it was hailed as a literal hero.
It was a top-secret military asset. You really have to understand the state of military technology in 1939. The Allies had this incredible new invention called radar. And radar is basically sending out these high-frequency radio waves into the sky or over the water and listening for the echo that bounces back. It is how you spot an enemy airplane or a submarine in the pitch dark or in heavy fog.
Right, which was a huge advantage.
Yeah.
But they had a massive hardware problem.
A completely debilitating hardware problem. High-frequency electrical signals are incredibly fragile. They tend to leak out of the transmission wires very easily. So to keep the signal trapped inside the wire where it belongs, you need insulation. But you can't just use anything. You need a material that does not conduct electricity at all. And crucially, it has to be light enough to be practical to carry around.
And what were they trying to use for insulation before they remembered the plastic?
They were using very heavy, very bulky traditional materials, things like hard rubber or ceramics or highly compressed paper. Because of this, the early radar sets were massive. They were literally the size of a small room. You could mount one on a huge naval battleship maybe, but you absolutely could not put one inside an airplane. It was just way too heavy for the plane to take off.
And meanwhile, while they're struggling with this, German U-boats are absolutely swarming the Atlantic Ocean.
They are decimating the Allied supply lines. These are the infamous wolf packs. They were torpedoing and sinking merchant ships much faster than the Allies could physically build new ones. The UK was an island nation, and they were literally starving. They desperately needed to spot these German submarines from the air before they could strike, but they couldn't get the heavy radar sets into the patrol planes.
Enter the waxy solid.
Enter polyethylene. It turns out when they finally tested it, that accidental white sludge from the Cheshire lab is the absolute perfect insulator for high-frequency radio waves. It's incredibly light, it's very flexible, and economically, it is practically invisible to the radio signal.
So they start coating all the radar cables in this new plastic.
Yes, and suddenly, almost overnight, you can shrink the entire radar set down. You can make it light enough to mount directly into the nose cone of a bomber plane.
I have this specific statistic here from Gardiner's book, and honestly, it is staggering when you read it. In 1943, right before they deployed the new plastic-insulated radar, the Allies lost 14 large supply ships to U-boats in the Atlantic in a single month.
14 ships in 1 month. That is thousands and thousands of tons of critical food, ammunition, and fuel just sent straight to the bottom of the ocean. It was devastating.
Then they finally deploy the planes, equipped with the polyethylene radar. In the next 5 months following that deployment,
0 losses.
let that sink in. From losing 13 ships in 1 month to 0 ships lost over 5 months.
It completely and utterly neutralized the U-boat threat in the Atlantic. There is actually this very chilling official report from a German admiral named Karl Donitz, writing back to Adolf Hitler in Berlin. He says the enemy has a new location apparatus. He knew the naval game was over. He formally called it a heavy setback.
He was entirely defeated by a plastic bag.
Essentially, yes. The exact same chemical material that helped defeat the Third Reich is the exact same material we casually use today to wrap a turkey sandwich and then throw in the garbage.
Which is exactly what makes this whole story so incredibly complicated. We vilify plastic now, and obviously for very good reasons we'll get into. But back in 1945, this material wasn't a villain at all. It was viewed as a miracle material. It was lighter than steel, it was rot-proof, it was bug-proof, it was waterproof.
It really was a miracle. But this brings us directly to the crux of the modern problem. The war finally ends, we've won, everyone is celebrating, but now you have companies like ICI in the UK and huge American chemical companies like DuPont and Union Carbide, and they have built these massive, sprawling factories that were running day and night, churning out tons of polyethylene for military radar cables.
And the military orders just stop overnight.
Total silence on the factory floor. The war machine shuts down. You have an enormous supply of this incredible material. You have the built-in industrial capacity to make thousands of tons of it, but suddenly you have zero demand. Regular civilians living in 1945 do not need high-frequency radar insulation for their homes.
So what do you do if you are the CEO of one of these companies?
Well, you have to invent a civilian use for it. And this leads us to what Gardiner calls the prehistory. because this actually wasn't the very first time humans had tried to synthesize a totally new material. To really understand the underlying mindset of this industry, we actually have to go back a bit further. Before the World Wars, all the way back to the smoky billiard halls of the 1860s.
The Ivory Crisis. I love this part because it honestly sounds like the title of an old adventure novel.
It does, but it was actually a massive ecological disaster in the making. So in the mid-19th century, playing billiards, or pool as we'd call it, was the single biggest game in the Western world. It was basically the video games of that era. Every single saloon, every local tavern, every high-end gentleman's club had a billiard table.
And all the billiard balls were made out of solid ivory.
Solid, pure ivory, harvested directly from the tusks of wild elephants.
I read in the source material that you could only get about 3, maybe 4 good, perfectly round billiard balls from a single elephant tusk.
That is correct. And to make matters worse, they found that they had to specifically use the tusks from female elephants from Ceylon, which is modern-day Sri Lanka, because only their ivory had the exact perfect density for the balls to roll correctly on the table. So if you just do the basic math, the massive exploding popularity of this bar game was directly driving the wholesale slaughter of elephant populations.
It was entirely unsustainable.
Completely. The price of raw ivory was absolutely skyrocketing. The major suppliers were panicking because they could clearly see they were going to run out of raw material and their industry would just collapse.
So a major billiard supply company in New York called Vaillant and Kolbert decides to make a very public offer.
They put out a bounty, essentially, a prize of $10,000 in gold, which is an absolute fortune in 1863. And the prize goes to anyone who can successfully invent a viable physical substitute for ivory.
Enter our next historical character, John Wesley Hyatt.
Right. So Hyatt is a printer from Albany, New York. He's not a formally trained chemist. He's just a tinkerer, a guy who likes to mess around in his shed. He wants that gold. So he starts mixing all sorts of random stuff together. He tries compressed wood pulp, he tries natural shellac, and eventually, through trial and error, he mixes raw cotton fiber with camphor and then treats the whole mixture with highly corrosive nitric acid.
Wait, nitric acid and cotton. Isn't that chemical combination effectively gun cotton, like a literal explosive material?
Yes, it is chemically very, very similar to smokeless gunpowder. But when Hyatt applied intense heat and pressure to it, he didn't blow himself up. Instead, he created a very hard, very smooth, shiny material. And he patented it and called it celluloid.
The world's very first semi-synthetic plastic.
Exactly right. And he immediately starts manufacturing billiard balls out of this new celluloid. At first glance, they look absolutely great. They're perfectly round, they roll true on the felt, but they had a slight volatility problem.
This is hands down my favorite detail in the entire book.
It's so funny. So Hyatt gets this letter in the mail from a saloon keeper out in Colorado. And the guy writes something like, "Mr. Hyatt, the billiard balls you sold me are fine, but every now and then when the players hit them against each other really hard, they go off with a loud crack like a pistol shot."
Which is really not ideal in a crowded Wild West saloon where literally everyone is armed.
No, not at all. The barman specifically said in the letter, "I don't personally mind the noise, but every single time it happens, every man in the room instantly pulls his gun."
Check, please. I am leaving this bar immediately.
Right. But despite the occasional minor explosions, celluloid proved something incredibly profound to the industrial world. It proved that human beings didn't have to, and this is Hyatt's own phrase, we didn't have to ransack the earth to find the materials we needed. We could just make them from scratch in a lab. We could forcibly manipulate molecules to create specific physical properties that nature simply didn't provide.
And this foundational idea eventually leads to the invention of bakelite in 1907, which was fully synthetic, and then eventually to our radar plastic during the war. But there is a really fundamental economic shift that happens right around here. And this is the concept of supply-side economics that Gardiner strongly emphasizes. I really want to spend a moment dwelling on this because it's a bit technical, but it is absolutely crucial to understanding the mess we are in today.
It is arguably the single most important economic concept in the entire book. Usually the way a normal business works is based on demand and supply.
Right.
You need a pair of shoes, so I see that demand and I make you some shoes. You're hungry and need food, so I grow some food to sell you.
The natural demand from the public creates the supply from the business.
Exactly. But with plastic, it is the exact opposite. The supply existed first.
Explain the Rockefeller logic for us.
Okay, so John D. Rockefeller, the head of Standard Oil, the absolute titan of the Gilded Age. The story goes, and it might be slightly apocryphal, but it is a perfect illustration of the industry mindset. He is doing a walking tour through one of his massive oil refineries in the late 1800s, and he looks up and sees a huge open flame burning on top of a tall smokestack.
Right, flaring off the excess
Yes.
gas, which we unfortunately still see today if you drive near any major refinery.
We do. So Rockefeller points up at the fire and asks his engineers what is burning up there. And they tell him, oh, it's just ethylene, sir. It's a waste gas left over from the oil refining process. It's completely useless to us. We just burn it off into the sky to get rid of it.
And a guy like John D. Rockefeller does not like waste.
He absolutely hates it. It offends him on a cellular level. He turns to the engineers and says, I don't believe in wasting anything. Find a use for it. Figure out something to do with it.
That specific command, figure out something to do with it, that is the true birth of the modern plastic industry.
Absolutely. Because plastic is, at its very core, a clever way to monetize the garbage of the fossil fuel industry. Think about it. You are a company refining crude oil to make kerosene or later on gasoline for cars. You are stuck with thousands of tons of this annoying ethylene gas. If you can use chemistry to turn that waste gas into a hard, physical, solid like polyethylene, you have literally turned your industrial trash into pure gold.
And this explains why plastic is so incredibly cheap. I've literally always wondered about that. How can a plastic spoon at a fast food place cost a tiny fraction of a cent? I mean, the oil has to be drilled, it has to be refined, it has to be shipped halfway across the world, it has to be melted and injection molded.
It's cheap because the core raw material is effectively a waste product. The massive oil companies have to get rid of the ethylene anyway. It is an almost completely free feedstock for the chemical plants.
So this dynamic creates what Gardiner refers to as the industrial marriage.
Yes. You have the major oil companies like Exxon and Shell on one side, and you have the massive chemical companies like Dow and DuPont on the other, and they are completely joined at the hip. In many modern cases, they are literally the exact same corporate entity. The oil refinery desperately needs the plastics plant next door to take away their waste gas, and the plastics plant desperately needs the refinery next door to provide them with dirt-cheap ingredients.
And this unholy marriage creates a continuous production push.
Exactly. It's an unstoppable cycle. If the global world demands more gasoline to drive more cars, the oil refineries have to run harder. If they run harder, they naturally produce vastly more ethylene waste. They absolutely must turn that excess ethylene into plastic. And once it's plastic, they must find a way to sell it to someone.
Even if nobody actually wants it.
Even if nobody wants it. The supply of plastic is entirely dictated by the oil market. It is not dictated by the consumer demand for plastic. So if the demand isn't naturally there, the industry has to artificially create the demand.
Which brings us right back to our timeline in 1945. The Second World War is over. The huge radar factories are sitting there full of this amazing material, and the wealthy executives at DuPont and Dow are looking out at an American population that, frankly, is still pretty frugal.
Right. They are still deeply entrenched in the Great Depression mindset. There was that famous saying back then, use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without.
That little rhyme is an absolute nightmare for a corporate plastic salesman.
It's a total disaster for their bottom line. If you successfully sell a housewife a durable, reusable plastic plate, she buys exactly one plate for the rest of her life, you will go out of business in a month.
So they realized they had to fundamentally change the American mindset. They had to, as Gardner puts it, manufacture the consumer.
And this kicks off section 2 of our dive. And it really starts with a historical quote that just chills me to the bone every time I read it. It is from a guy named J.W. McCoy, who was a senior vice president at DuPont right after the war ended. There was a lot of corporate fear at the time that the U.S. economy would crash right back into a severe depression without the military spending.
So what did he say to his executives?
He stood up and told them a satisfied people is a stagnant people.
God, that is so dystopian. It sounds like something straight out of Brave New World.
It was the guiding philosophy of the new consumer age. He passionately argued that to keep the massive industrial economy churning, they had to systematically ensure that everyday Americans were never fully satisfied with what they had. They had to actively create new artificial wants rather than just satisfying basic human needs. They openly talked about needing to teach the public the skills of consumption.
The skills of consumption. Like buying things is a trade craft you have to learn in school.
And they didn't mess around. They brought in the absolute heavy hitters of the era to make it happen. Have you ever heard of a guy named Edward Bernays?
The famous father of public relations. And I believe he was actually Sigmund Freud's nephew, right?
The very same. Bernays basically took his uncle's deep clinical insights into human psychology and weaponized them for corporate marketing. He fundamentally understood that you don't just sell a physical product, you sell an underlying feeling, you sell an identity.
And how did he specifically apply those psychological tactics to selling plastic?
Well, one of his earliest and biggest PR campaigns was pushing for the widespread adoption of disposable cups. At the time, most people obviously used durable, reusable cups made of glass or heavy ceramic. Bernays ran a massive nationwide campaign deliberately framing these reusable cups as deeply unsanitary. He publicly called them dangerous vectors for disease. He ruthlessly played on people's natural fear of germs and polio to sell the concept that a single-use plastic cup or a paper cup thickly coated in plastic was the only truly hygienic choice for a modern family.
So he literally scared the public into buying disposable garbage.
He completely manipulated the demand using fear, and the popular lifestyle magazines of the era just fell right in line with the messaging. House Beautiful magazine actually ran a huge special issue in 1947 titled "Plastics: A Way to a Better, More Carefree Life." And Gardiner found that the plastic industry executives actually helped the editors quietly rewrite the articles before publication. They promised the American housewife that plastics would magically free her from household drudgery.
And, to be completely fair to the people living back then, for a lot of folks, especially housewives of the 1950s, that was an incredibly compelling promise. Less heavy, washing up later unbreakable materials around kids.
Absolutely. We really can't ignore the fact that plastic provided genuine real-world convenience to millions of tired people. But the industry deliberately pushed it well beyond basic convenience. They aggressively pushed for what they internally called the invention of disposability.
This is the cultural shift that really matters in the grand scheme of things. In the 1950s, people naturally saved things. I mean, my own grandmother used to carefully wash out pieces of aluminum foil to use again. She saved every single rubber band that ever came into her house.
Exactly. But that deeply ingrained thriftiness was terrible for continuous business growth. Think of the math. If a customer buys a tough plastic plate and washes it every night for 10 years, the massive factory only gets to sell one plate. If you can socially condition that same customer to buy a flimsy plastic plate and throw it right into the trash after just one meal, they will sell her 3,000 plates over that same 10 years.
There's a specific quote in the book from Modern Plastics magazine, which was like a major industry trade journal at the time. And the editorial literally says the factor of disposability is key to sales volume. They were just openly saying the quiet part out loud to each other.
They knew they needed to actively teach everyday people how to throw things away.
Yeah.
And ironically, they used cheap children's toys and crazy fads to train the public to do it.
Let's talk about the hula hoop, because that story is just the perfect encapsulation of this strategy.
It is the absolute archetype of manufactured demand. So Phillips Petroleum had recently developed a brand new kind of chemical polymer high-density polyethylene. But unfortunately for them, their early industrial batches were completely off-spec. The plastic came out way too brittle. They couldn't use it to manufacture durable industrial pipes or anything serious like they planned.
So it was basically just a warehouse full of junk plastic.
Basically, yes. A huge financial loss. So they reached out and sold this bad batch dirt cheap to a quirky toy company in California called Wham-O. And Wham-O figured out they could extrude it into large, colorful tubes, and they released the hula hoop in 1957. And as we all know, it became a massive, unprecedented global craze. Millions and millions of them were sold in a matter of months.
I can literally hear the sound of it in my head right now. That hollow, scratchy shh sound on the driveway.
Right. And then millions of those same hoops were promptly thrown straight into the municipal garbage when the fad abruptly died out just a few months later. But for Phillips Petroleum, the oil company, it was a massive strategic win. They successfully got rid of their huge stockpile of bad plastic and actually turned a profit on their waste.
And more importantly, it proved a major concept to the boardroom executives. You can easily use this indestructible material for completely non-essential fleeting amusement. It doesn't have to be serious military radar insulation. It can literally be a silly neon toy that a kid plays with for 3 weeks and then discards. And they did the exact same thing with Silly Putty, right?
Yeah. Silly Putty was originally a failed synthetic rubber experiment from General Electric. They were desperately trying to invent a cheap rubber substitute for military vehicle tires during the war. It totally failed the durability tests. But a clever marketer eventually bought the patent, put a little glob of it inside a 2-piece plastic egg, and boom, another massive disposable hit.
And then we get to the really big one. The industry holy grail in 1961. Pampers.
Procter & Gamble. This product was the absolute peak of the disposability campaign. They took a daily dreaded chore-washing, soiled cloth diapers, which is admittedly very unpleasant, very smelly, and takes up a ton of time, and they replaced it with a miraculous product that you use exactly once for a few hours and then immediately throw away.
The sheer convenience factor for a stressed-out parent here is undeniably huge. I get it.
It is undeniable. But just stop and think about the physical volume involved. A single human baby uses thousands and thousands of diapers before they are potty trained. By successfully convincing the culture to switch from cloth to disposables, P&G single-handedly created a massive, permanent, non-degradable waste stream. Billions of plastic-lined diapers entering the world's landfills every single year, but they marketed it as freeing the modern parent. It's that core tension again, providing genuine daily convenience, but it's bought at the steep and visible price of permanent planetary waste.
It really highlights how strategically they manufacture the modern consumer. They didn't just passively fill a pre-existing need, they actively fundamentally changed human behavioral patterns across the globe. But if you think marketing disposable cups to scared mothers is manipulative, just wait until we get into Section 3 today, the smoking gun.
Yeah, this is where the historical story takes a very dark and frankly sinister turn.
We are introducing a brand new character to the narrative here. His name is Carol Muffett. He is an environmental lawyer. And he started personally digging deep into the corporate archives, looking for any hidden historical connections between big oil and another massive corporate villain of the 20th century, big tobacco.
Muffett is a total research geek in the best way possible. He absolutely loves spending days digging through dusty boxes of old, declassified corporate documents. And what he found was genuinely startling. We very often hear journalists and politicians talk about the denial playbook, right? How modern oil companies fund think tanks to publicly deny climate change using the exact same tactics that tobacco companies used in the 90s to deny that smoking causes lung cancer. And we naturally just assume that the oil guys just watched the tobacco guys and copied their homework.
But Muffett found out from the archives that they were actually in business together from the very beginning.
Exactly. He discovered that way back in the 1950s and 60s, massive oil companies like Shell and Esso, which obviously later became Exxon, they were actively consulting for and helping tobacco companies systematically analyze cigarette smoke.
Why? I mean, why would an oil refinery care at all about what is in cigarette smoke?
Because the oil companies already had the advanced proprietary technology, they were heavily invested in analyzing the chemical makeup of air pollution coming from their giant refinery smokestacks and from car tailpipes. So they already owned the extremely expensive mass spectrometers, and they employed all the top chemical engineers. So they quietly sign lucrative private contracts with big tobacco to definitively analyze exactly what chemical compounds were actually present inside cigarette smoke.
So the oil companies knew. They scientifically knew exactly how toxic cigarettes were decades before the public did.
Oh, they definitely knew. The internal memos Muffett found clearly show it. They specifically identified the lethal carcinogens in the smoke, and instead of acting ethically and saying, hey guys, maybe we should warn the federal government or the American public about this, they simply saw an untapped market opportunity.
Plastic filters.
Precisely. The oil companies executed a pivot to product. They aggressively pitched polypropylene, which is a form of plastic, as the ideal material to manufacture cigarette filters. Muffett actually found meeting minutes where senior oil executives are sitting down in private rooms with senior tobacco executives physically handing them samples of spun plastic filters.
Literally saying, here, take our plastic and use it to filter your highly toxic smoke.
Right. Now, historically, it didn't actually work out commercially at first because the early polypropylene gave the cigarette smoke a really weird artificial taste that smokers hated, but it firmly established the deep corporate connection. And today, almost all commercial cigarette filters on the market are made of a material called cellulose acetate, which is just another form of plastic. Trillions of those tiny filters are flipped onto the ground every year, making them the single most common ubiquitous form of plastic pollution in the entire world.
And the most infuriating part is they don't even work. They don't protect the smoker at all.
That is the outright fraud part of the story. Muffett uncovered an internal memo from Philip Morris that literally called the filter a mere advertising gimmick. The document explicitly stated that the filter was only designed to create the psychological illusion of filtration. It just made addicted smokers falsely think the cigarette was safer to consume so they wouldn't quit and would just keep buying packs.
This is honestly what makes my blood boil reading this specific chapter of the book. It's the sheer calculated cynicism of it all. You have these two massive global industries. One of them privately knows for a fact their product causes fatal cancer. The other one privately knows their product causes permanent global pollution and eventually climate change. And instead of changing, they just high-five in a boardroom and say, hey, let's invent a cheap plastic gimmick to keep the public confidently buying both of our products.
Moffat's ultimate conclusion from all these documents is that the infamous denial playbook didn't actually originate with big tobacco at all. We always colloquially say big oil is acting just like big tobacco. Moffat says no, the historical record shows big oil completely invented the playbook. They successfully used it first to aggressively deny the well-documented neurological dangers of adding lead to consumer gasoline. Then they actively taught those specific PR tactics to big tobacco. And now today, they are dusting off that exact same playbook to defend their massive plastic production.
The old slogan, doubt is our product.
Exactly. Just keep the public debate going endlessly. Put experts on TV to say the science isn't totally settled yet. Run expensive ad campaigns saying what we really need is far more individual recycling from consumers, not less overall plastic production from corporations. It is the exact same distraction strategy.
Which brings us firmly to the present day. Section 4 of our dive, which we're calling the escape hatch. Because a reasonable listener right now might be thinking, okay guys, that's all terrible, but that's ancient history from the 60s. Surely as a modern society, we are rapidly moving away from plastic now, right? I mean, everywhere I go, we have those terrible soggy paper straws. We have major cities enacting total bans on single-use plastic grocery bags. Things are getting better.
And that feeling of progress is exactly what the industry PR departments desperately want you to think. But if you actually look at the raw industrial data, it tells a completely terrifying different story. And to understand that, we need to briefly talk about a researcher named Roland Geyer.
Right, so Geyer is a prominent industrial ecologist, and he undertook this absolutely massive, comprehensive study back in 2017 to try and mathematically calculate exactly how much plastic has ever been manufactured in human history.
They colloquially call it the Ever Study. He and his team painstakingly crunched the global numbers and calculated that humanity has produced roughly 8.3 billion metric tons of virgin plastic since the 50s.
8.3 billion metric tons. I honestly can't even begin to visualize a number that large.
The author suggests thinking of it this way. It is literally enough physical material to seamlessly wrap the entire sphere of the Earth in a layer of cling film, multiple times over. But honestly, what's far scarier than the total historical amount is the current trajectory. Geyer's team found that fully half of the plastic ever made in the history of the world was manufactured in just the last 13 years.
Wait, I need to stop you. Half of all plastic ever made in human history was made since like the mid-2000s.
Correct. The rate of production isn't slowing down at all despite the paper straws. It is exponentially accelerating. He projects, based on current industry investments, that by the year 2050, we could easily be globally manufacturing 1.1 billion metric tons of new plastic every single year.
Why? I mean, if basically everyone hates plastic waste, if we all see the horrific pictures of sea turtles with straws in their noses, if national governments are constantly passing bans and regulations, why in the world is production exploding right now?
This brings us to the concept of the Plan B. This is really the core thesis of Beth Gardiner's entire book. The executives running the major oil companies are not stupid people. They can clearly read the writing on the wall for the future of gasoline.
The rise of electric vehicles.
EVs, yes, but also the massive scaling of grid-level solar power, offshore wind. The global transition away from fossil fuels to green energy is unequivocally happening. It might be moving slower than environmentalists want, but financially it is inevitable at this point. The global consumer demand for burning gasoline and diesel fuel is going to mathematically hit a peak and then violently crash. And if your massive multinational corporation's entire business model is exclusively based on pumping liquid oil out of the ground to be burned in car engines, that transition is an absolute existential threat to your survival.
So the plastic explosion is their financial hedge.
Plastic is the escape hatch. They have explicitly realized if they can't legally or economically burn the oil in cars anymore, they will just chemically turn that same oil into plastic packaging. It's the exact same raw material, just a different final product. ExxonMobil has actually publicly released internal projections stating that petrochemicals, which in industry terms largely just means plastics, will completely account for almost all of their global oil demand growth between now and 2050.
So when I am sitting on my couch and I see a slick TV commercial for a fancy new electric car, I think, oh great, we're saving the environment. But the oil executive sitting in a boardroom watches that same ad and just sees a lost customer for their gasoline, but a brand new gained customer for a fully plastic car dashboard, a plastic front bumper, and a heavily plastic-wrapped snack that the drivers can eat while they sit at the charging station.
It's actually much, much more aggressive than that. They are heavily betting their entire corporate future that the demand for cheap single-use plastic packaging in rapidly developing nations places across Africa, Southeast Asia, India will absolutely explode in the coming decades as a middle class grows there. They are entirely banking on it. They literally need that waste explosion to happen to survive as corporate entities.
And they are aggressively building the hard physical infrastructure right now to ensure it happens no matter what, which brings up this incredibly depressing concept of the lock-in.
Right. You have to realize you don't just wake up one morning and randomly decide to make 1,000,000 tons of plastic. You have to strategically build these massive, highly complex industrial facilities called cracker plants.
Yeah.
For example, Shell recently built a truly humongous one out in western Pennsylvania.
Describe what one of these cracker plants actually looks like on the ground.
They look like sprawling, futuristic cities made entirely of pipes. Literally miles and miles of shining steel tubing and towering chemical distillation columns. They take in millions of cubic feet of fracked natural gas. They superheat it to crack the molecular bonds to isolate the ethylene, and then they process it into tiny little raw plastic pellets. These mega plants easily cost billions of dollars to construct and take years to finish.
Billions of dollars for one plant.
And this massive capital investment is exactly the economic trap we are currently falling into. Once a corporation spends $6 billion to physically build a cracker plant, they absolutely have to run it. They are economically forced to run that plant at maximum capacity 24/7 for 30 or 40 years just to pay off the initial debt and make a profit for shareholders. You simply cannot afford to let a $6 billion asset sit idle just because consumers suddenly decide they don't want single-use bags anymore.
So by strategically building all these massive cracker plants right now today, they are effectively locking the global economy into producing high volumes of plastic until the 2060s or 2070s.
Completely regardless of what the average consumer actually wants. Completely regardless of what new environmental policies politicians pass. The raw economic inertia is already permanently set in concrete, or heavy steel, I should say. It is a massive sunk cost that aggressively demands a financial return.
And honestly, we haven't even really touched on the direct climate impact of the plastic material itself yet, because we have been thoroughly conditioned to usually only think of plastic as an ugly litter problem. But at a chemical level, it is literally just made of fossil fuels.
It is essentially just a block of solid fossil fuel. Geyer's research points out that if the global plastic industry were a sovereign country, it would officially be the 5th largest greenhouse gas emitter in the entire world. The manufacturing process releases massive amounts of carbon when the plastic is initially made, and then it slowly releases even more carbon decades later when it eventually degrades in the sun or is thrown into a municipal incinerator. Because the terrifying reality is, even if we successfully switch every single car on Earth to an EV tomorrow, if we simultaneously ramp up plastic production to compensate, we are still actively cooking the planet.
It really feels incredibly overwhelming when you lay it all out like that. Feels like this massive corporate machine is just totally unstoppable at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But the book does kindly give us some fascinating historical context on how we got here structurally with our daily lives, specifically regarding the food we eat. This is Section 5, the packaging revolution. Because the way we shop wasn't always like this.
No, it certainly wasn't. And this is a really fascinating bit of retail history that perfectly explains how our psychological relationship with our food totally changed. We actually have to talk about the concept of the Cracker Barrel.
To be clear, we mean an actual physical barrel full of crackers,
Yeah.
not the country-themed restaurant chain, right?
Yeah, the actual wooden barrel. So if you went to a local general store in a small town in the late 1800s to buy some simple crackers, the shopkeeper would literally just reach his bare hand into a large wooden barrel on the floor and scoop a bunch of loose crackers into a paper sack for you. They did the exact same thing for raw sugar, baking flour, pickles, you name it.
Mm-hmm. Which honestly sounds incredibly charming and smells really good in my imagination, but realistically, it probably wasn't very sanitary.
It was incredibly unsanitary. Mice got in the barrels, people coughed on them, and the crackers at the bottom got horribly stale and soft. But far more importantly, for the evolution of modern business, it was completely anonymous. When you bought crackers, You didn't buy a specific corporate brand. You just bought whatever generic crackers the guy had in the barrel that week.
And then along comes a guy named Adolphus Green.
Right, so Adolphus Green was actually a corporate lawyer who ended up taking over and running the National Biscuit Company, which we all know today as Nabisco. He desperately wanted to distinguish his specific crackers from the generic soggy stuff sitting in the local barrel. He essentially wanted to invent national branding.
Enter his big invention, the Anita biscuit.
The Anita biscuit package. It completely revolutionized retail. It was a sturdy cardboard box tightly lined with waxed paper. This sealed package kept the crackers perfectly crisp for months. It kept the store moisture and the mice out. And most crucially of all, the flat sides of the box allowed him to print a colorful brand logo directly on it. He put a famous painting of a little boy in a yellow raincoat on the cover to emphasize that it was waterproof.
And this simple box effectively severed the age-old trust link between the local grocer and the customer.
Exactly. Before the box, you intimately trusted your local grocer to select and give you good, fresh crackers. After the box, you didn't care about the grocer at all. You completely trusted the national corporate brand printed on the package. It massively shifted the retail power dynamic away from the local small-town shopkeeper straight to the distant national corporation. And it rapidly started the massive, unstoppable trend of individual single-use packaging for everything we buy.
But the real major battle, the specific corporate fight that truly defined the modern plastic waste crisis we are dealing with today, was what Gardiner calls the battle of the bottle.
This is an absolutely classic business case study. Let's go back again to the 1940s and 50s. Coca-Cola, the biggest beverage company on Earth, was exclusively sold in those iconic heavy glass bottles. But those thick glass bottles were incredibly valuable to the company. So when you bought a Coke, you also paid a small cash deposit. When you finished drinking your soda, you physically brought the empty glass bottle back to the store to get your coin back.
And the return rate on those glass bottles was insanely high, wasn't it?
It was almost perfectly efficient. 96% of bottles were returned. A single heavy glass bottle might be carefully washed and refilled by the local bottling plant up to 50 separate times before it finally broke or was retired. It was an incredibly successful circular economy operating perfectly at scale decades before we even invented a fancy buzzword for it.
So what possibly killed such a perfectly functioning system?
Corporate centralization and greed. See, the whole glass bottle system fundamentally relied on a massive network of small, independent, local bottlers. The main Coca-Cola company in Atlanta would just ship huge vats of the concentrated syrup on trains. But a small franchise plant right in your own hometown would actually mix it with local water, put it in the heavy glass bottles, and drive it around to the stores. They absolutely had to do it locally because full, heavy glass bottles are just way too expensive and heavy to ship long distances on truck.
Right. I mean, you obviously can't profitably ship thousands of heavy glass bottles full of liquid all the way from Atlanta up to Seattle. It costs way too much in diesel fuel to move that much weight.
Exactly. It eats all your profit. But then the steel and aluminum companies came along and heavily pushed the concept of the one-way container. First, it was thin steel cans, then lightweight aluminum, and then eventually thin PET plastic bottles. These new containers were incredibly lightweight, and more importantly, you didn't have to ever get them back from the customer to wash them. This meant the massive beverage corporations didn't need to share profits with a local franchise bottler in every single town anymore. They could just build one massive, highly automated mega factory, run it 24 hours a day, and cheaply ship the lightweight plastic product everywhere across the entire country.
So these massive global companies like Pepsi and eventually Coke, they completely adopted and pushed these throwaway plastic containers, not because the customers were begging for them, but strictly because the lightweight plastic allowed them to ruthlessly crush the local franchise competition, centralize their production, and keep all the profits for themselves.
Correct. It was purely an aggressive efficiency play for the stock price. But there was a massive hidden catch to this whole system. Who actually pays the financial cost of dealing with the bottle once it's empty and thrown away?
Well, in the old circular system, the local bottler had already paid a lot for the heavy glass bottle, so he desperately wanted it back. In the new one-way plastic system,
In the new system, the centralized corporation sells you the cheap plastic package. Once you hand over your money, it is instantly your personal problem. Or, more accurately, it is your local city government's expensive problem to deal with.
they completely shifted the structural cost.
They executed one of the most brilliant and devastating economic sleight-of-hand tricks in modern human history. They successfully shifted the entire massive cost of physical waste disposal completely off their own corporate balance sheets and dumped it directly onto the local taxpayer. You and I pay for the municipal landfills with our local taxes. We pay for the expensive recycling trucks. We pay for the volunteers to do the beach litter cleanups. The corporations just sit back, mass produce the garbage, and count the record profits.
God, it is just so incredibly frustrating when you finally see the whole machine laid bare like that. So let's try to quickly recap what we have actually learned today from diving into Beth Gardiner's Plastic Ink, because this has honestly been a lot of heavy information to process.
It really has. We essentially learned today that the modern plastic explosion didn't just passively happen to us. It wasn't just some miracle scientific invention that the public organically demanded because we needed it. It was aggressively pushed onto society. It was pushed by a massive fossil fuel industry that desperately needed a profitable way to monetize their toxic industrial waste products like ethylene gas.
We learned that the whole pervasive cultural narrative around personal recycling, the heavy idea that the pollution is entirely our individual fault, that we need to feel deep personal guilt when we throw away a cup, is essentially a highly funded corporate distraction. The real undeniable driver of the crisis is the massive producers' underlying economic need for eternal quarterly growth.
And we also clearly saw the historical receipts, the deep documented backroom ties between big oil, big tobacco, and the deliberate psychological strategy of manufacturing public doubt just to keep the factories running.
And finally, I think we clearly see the true global stakes of the current moment. This entire issue isn't just about saving the sea turtles, although obviously I love turtles and we should save them. This is about the terrifying plan B for the fossil fuel industry. Mass plastic production is quite literally their financial insurance policy against the world taking meaningful climate action.
It completely reframes the entire scope of the problem. This isn't just a sad environmental story about litter on a highway. It is a massive, ongoing corporate scandal story.
So here is the final provocative thought I want to leave you all with today. I want you to go all the way back to that mental exercise we did at the very beginning of the show. You are standing in your kitchen holding that black plastic takeout container. You are feeling that familiar little twinge of modern recyclers' guilt.
The real core question you have to ask yourself is this. If endless plastic production is actually the oil industry's calculated survival strategy, can we ever truly hope to solve the global plastic waste crisis without completely dismantling the underlying fossil fuel business model itself?
And deeply knowing what you know now, knowing that your specific personal choice to buy and discard that cheap plastic was carefully engineered in a corporate boardroom by guys like Edward Bernays over 70 years ago, does that fundamentally change how you look at the plastic package in your hand right now?
It certainly changed the way I look at the grocery store, I can tell you that.
It's definitely a lot to think about the next time you take out the recycling. Thanks for diving deep with us today, everyone.
See you next time.